Hello, BookTube. You're going to have to pardon some background noise in this latest installment of my library tour. Let's see what's going on here. We've got shoveling and snow blowing. The road outside is being cleaned, and as you can hear, my little dog is currently mauling one of the Russian children. This is a fairly normal day, but I'm hoping that you can hear me anyway, even though I'm dulcet toned. And I want to continue with my library tour. I am once again here in the old house in Vermont. So, despite the urging from many of you, I am not going to start pulling books off shelves here and talking about them. We'll get back to my library eventually. But I have, fortunately, lots and lots of scan books that I don't have to pull off a shelf that we can still talk about, that I've had at one point in my life and don't have anymore. So we'll just go quickly through the next one of those. And the first one is by Royston Lambert, and this is Beloved and God. Oh, God. Oh, God. Oh, my. Here, let's turn over here and see if that... Oh, that's a little better. And this is his book about the Roman Emperor Hadrian and the boy that Hadrian fell in love with, Antinous. And when you're a Roman emperor and you fall in love with a boy, believe you me, you go big. You go big or you go home. And that was true in this case. Hadrian named towns after this boy. He erected statues everywhere. The lickspittles in his empire and in his immediate circle who wanted to curry favor with the emperor erected statues of the boy in their home. No great hardship, because as far as we can tell, Antinous was beautiful, but we don't know as much about what Antinous thought about all of this unless we are to read into something into that, to the fact that he killed himself. You can get a great, just flat out great historical representation of this in the Memoirs of Hadrian by Marguerite Yourcenar, but this is a nonfiction book that looks at the sources, what we know, what we can figure out about what was going on here. An odd thing, because I mean, in later Roman emperor biographies, you wouldn't think much of the emperor having basically a sex toy favorite. But the thing that makes it odd about Hadrian, at least on a surface reading of the sources, is that there doesn't seem to be any debauchery here. It's not like there were many. It's an odd relationship that comes forward when you read these things. So if you're looking for a nonfiction account of that relationship, this is still the best one. Until the day when we get a great 800-page, really readable, fantastic, full-dress biography of Hadrian in English for the 21st century. That day may never come. Then we have Peter Newman. This was a fat Penguin mass market paperback that I got years ago. Don't have this in any form anymore. It made rollicking good reading. This is Company of Adventurers. And this is a story about the men who founded the Hudson Bay Company. All the adventures that they had, especially lots of nautical adventures. Just a rip-snorting good story about founding a mercantile company in what was then the wildest of wildernesses. I thought this was really well done. If I were to spot it again at the Brattle Bookshop, if I ever go back to the Brattle Bookshop, I would be happy to get a copy. Although, let me add my usual parenthetical Steve harangue here. The Hudson Bay Company was entirely built on killing and ripping the skins off animals who had been living in that wild wilderness for 5 million years before humans showed up. Building complex societies, teaching their young, loving their young, in the case of beavers, erecting complex technological structures. And this company existed entirely on harvesting those things as if they were crude oil. And that was often ugly and often brutal. So just so we're on the same subject here. Someday we'll get to the point, I won't see it, but someday we'll get to the point where people will look at this kind of a book with revulsion, and you'll have to convince them to read it for the fun reading that it is. This next one I'm noticing is a mass market paperback. It was from Avon back when they did these kinds of paperbacks, and it's a book that's come up on this channel a few times. It's Dale Van Every's nonfiction work, Disinherited. A great nonfiction work about the history of white settlers dealing with the Native American population that they found in the New World when they got here. The Native American population that had sprawling, complex, and centuries-old civilizations before any white man came to this country. And some of those civilizations were well-armed. Some of them really knew the territory. In other words, it was in your best interest to try and treat with them. rather than just execute full-scale warfare. And so various governments, including the United States government, did try to treat with them. Never, honestly, never, not once, honestly. They were told, the various tribes, the various leaders were told, we solemnly swear, and we will write it in a document and sign it in a solemn ceremony that you can have from this peak all the way down to the ocean, all of these valleys, all the way down to the ocean. A fraction of the land you once had, but a large and beautiful fraction. And then at gunpoint, though the same signatures of that treaty would be marched across the hill into barren chaparral, and told, this is where you're going to live forever. And it's the story. The book is one story after another of that, without ever any honest brokers. So be prepared for outrage and bile and whatnot. But nevertheless, it's an invaluable book to read. I don't think it's been in print in a long time. It doesn't share the same fate as other great Native American books do, where it's kept alive, where it's kept reprinted. It's full of travesties and brutalities and the absolute evil that the United States government could be, which is a little bit ironic and feels a little bit weird to say on this Friday of all Fridays, because this Friday the Republican National Committee, reflecting on the events of last January 6th, when President Donald Trump incited a violent insurrection to murder his vice president, sack the capital of this country, and install himself as an unelected dictator, presumably for life, the Republican National Committee reflected on those events today and called it, quote, legitimate political discourse. And this news broke on the same day that news broke that a fringe but nevertheless intensely popular pastor in Tennessee burned books. He burned a pile of Twilight and Harry Potter books. So it's a little difficult to look at a book like Disinherited and say with a straight face that anything has changed. I know things have, but nevertheless, it's on my mind today. Okay, this next one is a scholarly work. You won't be able to find it, and I don't know what you should make of it if you did. This is by Daniel Garrison. It's a great book. I wish I still had it. Since I scanned it, I know I once did, but I don't anymore. This is the Epodes and Odes of Horace. Lovely trade paperback that I scanned a long, long time ago. And this is the great Roman poet Horace, but this is not, so-and-so's new translation. This assumes that you know how to read Horace in the original. So this is all, it's invaluable amounts of introduction and notes and even metrical analysis, but not a place to go if you don't know how to read Latin. If you have never read Horace in the original and you maybe even never read a translation of it, this is not the place to start. It's the next thing up on the listing. That's all. Oh, okay. All right. Well, we go from one language that isn't English to another. This is a doorstop of a thing by Jacques Le Goff, the great historian Jacques Le Goff. This is his big, fat biography of St. Louis. And it's fantastic. This was from the 2000s, maybe? It's before the ready use of the internet, I remember, because I learned about this in Publishers Weekly, I think, with people openly speculating about whether or not it would ever be translated into English. And I had a friend who was going over to Europe for a business trip. And I begged and pleaded with him, could you please go to a bookstore and buy this thing, and I'll reimburse you, because I'm never going to see it in English. And he did. Very nice of him to do, and it is fantastic. This author has written a lot of stuff, but this is by far the best thing that he's ever written. God knows where my copy of this book came, and I was wrong. 15 years later, it did get an English language translation that I thought was terrible. I don't have that either. I don't have the bad English language translation, and I don't have the French original. So no idea why. Where would I even send this thing? Who would I give it to? But I did. Okay, then we have Arthur Synogen and Arthur Boak and William Synogen. This is a history of Rome, all the way to 8565. This was for a long time a standard Roman history textbook in schools. Lots and lots of good notes, very good broad-scale introductions. If it were readily available, a lot of you email me and ask, what's a good one-volume history of Rome? And if this were readily available, I would recommend it before anything else, but it's not. It's an old textbook. It's been out of print forever and ever. I wish I still had the copy that I scanned, but I never even see it anymore. Never. Okay, this next one is Lawrence Lefort. This is The Long Fuse, an interpretation of the origins of World War I. And you can't really make out that cover, but the first guy from the left is Franz Ferdinand. And the second guy from the left is Lawrence LaFleur. He's that old. He's just this old, crusty, almost brainless by the time I met him. I met him in Iowa, right at the end of his teaching career. That career was amazing, I should point out. I met him when he had degenerated to the point where someone in his life should have said, don't get in front of a lecture room anymore. Just retire. But no one did. No one could. He was an imperious old guy. But the height of his career, his lectures were things that people waited outside in the hall hoping that there'd be room. His lectures got applause. His students in the room would burst into applause, stand up and applaud him. So it's no small thing, but none of that virtuosity is in this book. None whatsoever. This is a dead, dull, pompous old fart just telling you the way things are. There's none. World War I brings out so much great literature in people who write about it, but not in this case. Even though I'd be willing to bet that when Lawrence LaFleur wrote this book, he probably knew more about the subject than anybody. But it absolutely did not matter. Okay, then we have an indie thing. I don't know if you're going to make this out. It's called Thenarthur Fought. I should say the author's name, Howard Wiseman. I don't know. This was an indie press. I got this when I was the U.S. and worldwide indie editor of the Historical Novel Review. And I used to get piles of books in the mail all the time, every week, to consider for review in the Historical Novel Review's review section. And a lot of them were really bad. And I looked at this thing. It's got a computer-printed cover. And it's yet another Arthurian retelling. And I thought, okay, well, I don't know about much hope for this. And it's great. Absolutely great. The list that I always say I'm going to do, I will do a starter kit on Arthurian literature. This would be on it, even though no one's ever heard of it. And it was indie published. Never had a real publisher as far as I know. And this is the author looking at the Arthurian time period. So from the departure of the Romans from Britain through the next couple of centuries. It's not just Arthur's story. But the author looks at that time period, researches it accurately, and then writes the results as if it were Geoffrey of Monmouth or Gregory of Tours or something. He writes it in the style, in the voice of the historical annal accounts of that period. The closest example I can come up with for someone that does the same thing is Deus Lo Volt by Evan S. Connell, where he researches the Crusades and then writes it as a Crusade chronicle, writes it in that style. And it's every bit as effective here. Never heard of this guy before. I don't think he has a mainstream publishing career, but he bloody well ought to. This thing was great. It is a fantastic novel, a fantastic treatment of the Arthurian mythos. So I would say don't miss it, but I don't know how you could avoid missing it. I don't know that it's in print anymore or that you could find a copy. And needless to say, I don't have my copy anymore. No idea what happened to it. Okay, this next one, I don't even see the author. This is probably just one of those larger illustrated books, History of the Typewriter. There's an Underwood typewriter on the cover there. These things aren't hard to find, but I remember this one being really good. I wish that I still had it because the typewriter is entirely gone. Right? It's a kind of technology that held sway for a comparative minute of time and then disappeared. It's completely gone now. If you meet someone, it'll be a young man, not a young woman, and if you meet a young man who says that he types everything on his typewriter before he shows it to anybody, flee in the opposite direction. Flee. Because in his closet at home is one brown shirt after another, and he's just waiting for someone to tell him to kill you. He is physically dangerous to you. But people occasionally will still have this stupid affectation. I call it stupid affectation even though I lived on my typewriter, absolutely lived on it, and I love the thing. The feeling of pounding away on it was the saddest part of transitioning from a typewriter to a computer. Wasn't leaving the beloved old machine behind. I could take that machine apart and put it back together blindfold. No, the hardest part of leaving that behind was leaving behind the pounding on the keyboards. You can't do that. If you have a MacBook Air and you pound on the keyboards, you're going to go through one every year. So I eventually had to try my hardest. I'm still not all that good at it, but I had to try my hardest to lock up the tension of the typing process in your elbows. That's the key to doing it. You lock up the tension in your elbows and your fingers are just typing. They're just moving very lightly across the keyboards. Whereas with a mechanical typewriter, you sat elbows on knees forward and all of the tension was in your wrists, pounding away on the keyboards, and it was very, very satisfying. Those of you who've never used one of these machines, when you were done with the line and you had to return the carriage, a little bell rang. It was delightful. It doesn't sound it, but it was. It was messy and clunky, but it was delightful. And I remember I had a typewriter like this. It wasn't that style Underwood, but I had a typewriter like this that belonged to my father. I used it on everything forever and ever. And I remember vividly the day I got what was called a slimline, a little mechanical typewriter with a plastic lid that had a handle in it. And it wasn't very heavy. I started taking that thing with me when I went on trains or when I went to visit people. And I remember thinking that that was a huge advance in technology. And now I'm showing you the picture of this technology on a device that can hold 50 times the amount of information that's in the Library of Congress. so you never know. Who knows what the technology will look like in 10 years. I still have that old typewriter, but I would never use it. I am not a dude bro fascist, so I would never actually use it. Writing is to be shared, after all. You type something on a typewriter, you're one step along the way to sharing it with anybody. Give me computers any day. I am not, weepy-eyed and nostalgic for the days of manual typewriters. And then this last one is a little bit of a surprise. This is a sports biography. Not the usual thing you see here on my channel, but it's really good. In fact, it's so good that I believe I am blurbed on the paperback. This is Mike Stanton's biography of Rocky Marciano, Unbeaten, which is the story of boxing, of course, and the sequences that are in here that are set in the ring. That's, if you write a book on boxing, your book is going to live or die by how well you do those scenes. If you do those scenes poorly, it doesn't matter how good you are at anything else. And this author does a fantastic job at those scenes. You'll be holding your breath. During the narration of boxing matches that are almost a century old, you'll be holding your breath. But this is more than that. This ends up, that's all I went into it expecting, but it's more than that. It ends up being a very complicated but very convincing portrait of an upright man, of a moral individual in a sport that wasn't moral at a time when the country wasn't moral. Although, even when Rocky Marciano was at the height of his powers, there was no one of any political party anywhere on the spectrum, including the Ku Klux Klan, that would call a murderous armed legitimate political discourse. So the politics weren't as dark as they could have been. Sorry, it's on my mind. But we're wrapping up now, so you don't have to hear any more about it, which is more than you can say for some of the unhappy inhabitants of this old house. Because although I'm done with it in this video, I'm not done ranting about it at all. But anyway, this is what we'll end with. If you are interested in boxing, which I'm typically not, don't miss this book. Absolutely don't miss this book. And there you go. That is our library tour of the lost for today. More books that I don't have that I wish I did. Even the one where I'm blurbed on the cover, I don't have a copy. But such is life. So I'll wrap this up for now, and we'll continue tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.